He heard a little girl crying at the airport, then saw his ex and realized the child was his daughter. The airport was crowded, the kind of late afternoon chaos that blurred strangers together into one rushing, impatient crowd. Colton Harper moved through the terminal like he always did, focused, confident, a man whose time was more valuable than anyone else's around him. Dressed in a sharp dark suit that complemented his blonde, slightly curled hair and piercing blue eyes, he barely registered the faces passing by. He was used to control, to efficiency, to silence unless he chose to break it. That's why the sound hit him so hard. It wasn't loud, but it was raw, small, fragile, and unmistakably real. A child crying. He almost ignored it. That would have been the old Colton's instinct, to keep walking, to believe it wasn't his problem. But something about the sound stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the cry of a child throwing a tantrum. It was deeper, scared and tired, like the world had become too much for someone too small to understand it. He turned his head and scanned the crowd. And that's when he saw her. A little girl, no older than 4, in a pale dress, her face hidden against the shoulder of a young woman kneeling beside her. The woman was whispering, clearly trying to soothe the child, brushing blonde curls out of her face. And then his breath caught. The girl's hair, those soft curls, so familiar. The shape of her eyes, the way her bottom lip trembled, it was like looking at a memory he hadn't known was missing. He took a few cautious steps forward, suddenly gripped by a feeling he didn't understand. The woman lifted her face, her eyes meeting his for a single second, and that second was enough to dismantle 4 years of hardened emotion. Emily. He hadn't seen her since the night he threw her out of his penthouse. The night he accused her of betrayal, shouted words he could never take back, slammed a door on everything they had built. She looked different now, older, somehow both tired and stronger. Her light brown hair was pulled back loosely, and her eyes, still the same icy blue, widened in disbelief. She hadn't changed entirely, but she'd clearly lived through something heavy. And the little girl, she clung to Emily with quiet desperation, the kind only a child whose known instability understands. Colton couldn't move. Couldn't think. He stood there, airport noise around him like static. 1,000 thoughts screamed in his head, but one rose above them all. She looks like me. He didn't know how to ask. Didn't know if he was allowed. But as the girl peeked up from her mother's shoulder, her tear-streaked face turned toward him. Their eyes met, his blue, hers identical. And something inside him shattered. He stepped closer, his voice uncertain for the first time in years. Emily, is she? Emily stood up slowly, placing a protective hand on the child's back. She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, and he could see the fight in her, the pain, the history neither of them had faced. She took a deep breath. Yes, she said. She's yours. The airport faded. His flight, his schedule, his carefully crafted world, they all disappeared. In that moment, nothing else mattered but the little girl watching him with wide, cautious eyes, and the woman he had once loved, who had clearly carried far more than he ever imagined. Colton didn't speak. He couldn't. His lips parted as if to form a question, but no sound came. For the first time in years, the man who dominated boardrooms, silenced executives, and made billion-dollar decisions with ease found himself completely wordless. Emily looked different, but not unfamiliar. The curve of her jaw, the steadiness in her gaze, he remembered it vividly. What he hadn't expected was the way her presence felt so grounded, so real, while his own world tilted off its axis. They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by travelers and noise, but somehow sealed off from all of it. The little girl tugged at Emily's sleeve, confused by the tension between the two adults. Emily finally looked down at her daughter, brushing a hand gently over her curls. Then she looked back up at Colton and said, quietly, "We should talk somewhere else." He followed them through the terminal to a quieter area near the large windows overlooking the runway. They found a small bench, and Emily sat down first, placing the girl, Lila, he would later learn, on her lap. Colton stood awkwardly, unsure of his place in this new, uninvited scene. His heart thundered in his chest, every step forward haunted by guilt and fear and the terrible realization that he had missed 4 entire years of this little life. Lila stared at him, unsure. She wasn't frightened, but she wasn't entirely open either. Children sense things adults can't hide. She clung to her mother's arm as if trying to interpret the situation through her. Colton crouched slightly, trying to appear less intimidating. "Hi," he said softly. I'm Colton." Then he looked at Emily, his voice cracking. "You didn't tell me." Emily didn't flinch. "You didn't ask," she replied, her voice calm, but not cruel. "You told me to leave. You were done. I was pregnant. And I knew if I told you, you'd either fight for control or disappear even harder. I didn't want to gamble on either. I had to think about her first." The weight of her words hit him with full force. He had chosen distance. He had walked away in anger, certain that he'd been wronged, that he was protecting his pride. And in doing so, he had missed first words, first steps, first birthdays. His daughter's entire beginning had unfolded without him. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I believe you," Emily said. "But that doesn't erase the years." He nodded, slowly sitting on the opposite end of the bench. "What's her name?" "Lila." He repeated it under his breath, as if it was fragile. "Lila. His daughter. She's 4. She'll be 5 in October," Emily said. "She likes puzzles and dinosaurs and hates when her socks don't match. She wants a puppy, but we live in a building that doesn't allow pets. She's smart, stubborn, and she sings in her sleep sometimes." Every detail carved something new into his chest. He had missed it all. "Can I talk to her?" Emily looked down at Lila. "Sweetheart, this is Colton. He's someone very special." Lila looked at him with curiosity. She said nothing, but nodded once. He leaned in a little closer, keeping his tone light. "I used to love puzzles, too. When I was little, I'd lose pieces all the time and try to convince everyone it was the cat's fault." She cracked the smallest smile. "We don't have a cat." "No. Then you're already ahead of me." For a few minutes, they talked about nothing, her favorite ice cream, strawberry, her favorite dinosaur, Triceratops, and how she once tried to build a spaceship out of cereal boxes. Emily watched closely, not interfering, but ready to step in if needed. But it wasn't needed. Something in Colton softened in Lila's presence. He wasn't performing. He was just there. Eventually, Emily stood. "We have to go," she said gently. Colton stood too, panic creeping in. "Will I see her again?" "That depends," Emily said. "I'm not here to punish you. But I won't open this door if you're not willing to walk through it every day. She doesn't need more abandonment. She needs stability." He nodded. "I want that. I want to be part of her life. I don't care how slow it has to be, I'm not leaving again." Emily studied him, and for the first time, he saw something change in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. Lila waved a little as they walked away, and Colton stood there long after they were gone, staring at the spot they'd been. He felt the world shift beneath him. Not collapse, not fall apart, just shift. Into something truer. Something terrifying. Something that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it might matter more than anything he had ever built. Colton didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in the quiet of his penthouse, staring out at the glowing skyline that had once made him feel powerful and invincible. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the man he had become, flawless suit, impeccable grooming, but hollow in the ways that mattered. He had built his life around control, around perfection, around winning. But no amount of success could compete with the weight of what he had seen that afternoon. A little girl with his eyes. A woman he had abandoned carrying a secret he had never imagined. He kept replaying Lila's face in his mind, those curious eyes, the soft smile she gave when he joked about cereal box spaceships. She hadn't known who he was, not really. And yet something about their moment had felt real. He got up and walked through the silent apartment, stopping in front of the one room he never used. Years ago, he'd planned it as a future nursery, back when he and Emily had first talked about starting a family. It had stayed empty, locked, the door almost symbolic of what he had refused to face. That night, he opened it for the first time in 4 years. The room was clean, untouched. Still painted in pale yellow, with a shelf full of unopened children's books. He sat down on the floor, suddenly overwhelmed with grief. He had chosen pride over vulnerability, anger over questions. And in doing so, he had missed everything. The next morning, he called his assistant and cleared his schedule indefinitely. He didn't give a reason. He didn't feel like one was needed. He spent the day researching legal advice, reading about paternity rights, and learning, really learning, what it meant to re-enter a child's life after years of absence. He wasn't naive. He knew Emily had every right to keep him at a distance. But he also knew something had shifted in her expression yesterday. She hadn't shut the door. Not completely. He texted her later that day. Not with demands or guilt or apologies. Just a question, would you let me take Lila to the park sometime? I'd like to know her better. And I'd like her to know me, even just a little. There was no response for hours, and he respected that. He went for a walk to clear his head, and when he returned, her reply was waiting. We'll be at Central Park tomorrow at 3. Don't be late. He wasn't. He arrived 30 minutes early and spent that time pacing near the playground, palms sweaty, heart racing in a way that billion-dollar mergers never managed to provoke. At exactly 3 p.m., he saw them. Emily walking beside Lila, holding her hand gently, her expression unreadable. Lila spotted him first. She waved again, small, cautious. He waved back, smiling. Emily sat on a nearby bench while Lila ran to the swings. Colton approached slowly, uncertain if he was supposed to speak to Emily first or Lila. Emily answered for him with a short nod. Go on, she said. She's been asking about you all morning. His heart thudded as he walked over to the swings. Lila looked up at him with a grin that melted every defense he still carried. Push me, she asked. He nodded, stepping behind her and gently pushing the swing. Not too high, he asked. I like it medium, she said confidently, and he laughed. They stayed in the park for over an hour. They talked about her favorite books, her dream of becoming a paleontologist, and how she once built a Lego tower taller than her whole body. She asked questions too, some light, like his favorite color, blue, and some that hit deeper. Why don't you live with us? He answered carefully. Because I didn't know I had you. But now that I do, I want to be here as much as I can. She seemed to accept that, for now. Emily watched from a distance, her expression softening as she saw Lila laugh and lean into Colton like she'd known him longer than a day. When it was time to leave, Lila hugged him tightly without being asked. It caught him off guard. He hugged her back with every part of himself. She ran ahead, leaving him and Emily alone for a moment. She had a good time, Emily said. I did too. Emily looked at him directly. I want to be clear about something. I'm letting you in because she wants to know you. But this doesn't erase the past. And I won't let her get hurt if you change your mind or disappear. I won't, he said. Not again. I promise. There was a silence between them, not cold, but cautious. She's special, he added. I know, Emily said. I raised her. As she walked away with Lila's hand in hers, Colton stood there with the realization that everything he had built, every accolade and dollar and trophy deal, it all meant nothing without this. Without her. Without them. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man chasing redemption. He felt like a father learning how to earn his place. One afternoon at a time. The weeks that followed became a quiet, determined test of consistency for Colton. He showed up, every time, early, patient, present. He no longer lived in the world of fast deals and powerful impressions. Now, he existed in a smaller, much more demanding universe made up of crayons, juice boxes, and questions he had no clever answers for. He met Emily and Lila at the park every Saturday and sometimes on weekday afternoons, depending on Emily's work schedule. The rhythm of these meetings became not only familiar, but something Colton began to depend on, something that tethered him to a life that was finally making sense. Lila was cautious but curious. Some days she was talkative, full of energy, dragging him toward slides and asking for piggyback rides. Other days, she just wanted to sit beside him and tell him about her dreams, or how she thought dinosaurs were probably afraid of the dark too. She never called him Dad yet, and he never asked her to. Instead, he listened, really listened, and responded to what she needed. When she was too tired to speak, he held her hand. When she was silly, he let himself be ridiculous too, spinning in circles or pretending the bench was a rocket ship. Emily noticed. She didn't say much, but her body language shifted. She no longer stood apart like a referee waiting for something to go wrong. Now she often sat nearby, relaxed, sometimes laughing quietly at things Lila said, other times quietly observing as Colton gently helped their daughter with her shoes or braided a messy ponytail with painstaking care. He wasn't perfect. He fumbled often, got facts wrong, mixed up snacks. But what mattered to Emily, perhaps more than anything, was that he tried. He never treated his presence like a favor or a performance. He was in it. Fully. One Thursday afternoon, Emily called him unexpectedly. He hadn't expected to hear her voice between scheduled visits, and his heart jumped when he saw her name on the screen. When he answered, she sounded tired but calm. Lila's school called. She had a fever and had to come home early. I have a meeting I can't miss in an hour. Could you stay with her for a bit? He didn't even hesitate. I'm already on my way. When he arrived at Emily's apartment, she opened the door, and he saw Lila curled up on the couch with a blanket and flushed cheeks. She managed a faint smile when she saw him, and he immediately knelt beside her, brushing her hair back gently. Heard you're not feeling great, he said. My head feels like a balloon, she murmured. He smiled and nodded. Then we'll keep it from floating away. Emily gave him instructions quickly, medicine times, water, what not to feed her, and then paused. Are you sure you're okay here? I want to be here, he said. Thank you for trusting me. She left, and for the first time, Colton was completely alone with his daughter. No scripts, no observers. Just the two of them, and a quiet room full of softness and responsibility. He didn't try to distract her or entertain. Instead, he just sat with her, read from her favorite picture book in a calm voice, and sang softly when she started to fall asleep. She drifted off holding his finger in her small, burning hand. When Emily returned 2 hours later, she found them asleep together, Lila curled up against his side, Colton slouched awkwardly but protectively on the edge of the couch. She didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway and took it in. A part of her heart, the part she'd closed off long ago, stirred. Later that night, she sent him a message. Not long, just a simple line, she asked if you'd be there when she wakes up tomorrow. He read it 3 times before replying. If you'll let me, I will. That night, for the first time in years, Colton didn't feel like a visitor in someone else's world. He felt like a father. And deep down, quietly, Emily was beginning to believe he might finally stay. Colton started to reorganize his life in ways he hadn't thought possible just months ago. The man who once worked 16-hour days without blinking now set boundaries with his board, delayed meetings, and even turned down high-profile travel opportunities. Some executives called it a midlife crisis. Others whispered that he'd lost his edge. But Colton didn't care anymore. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was building something that mattered, and it didn't require applause or profit margins. It required time, humility, and presence, and that was a lesson he'd learned the hard way. He began attending more of Lila's activities, library story times, weekend art classes, even her first little school recital. At first, he stood in the back, unsure if his presence would disrupt more than it helped. But as the weeks passed, Lila began searching for him in the crowd. The first time she spotted him and waved mid-song, he nearly broke down. He didn't wave back immediately, too stunned by the purity of her recognition. Afterward, she ran into his arms without hesitation, and he realized he had crossed an invisible line. He wasn't a stranger trying to earn her affection anymore. He was part of her life. Meanwhile, his relationship with Emily began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. They spoke more often, not just about Lila's meals or appointments, but about real things, how her job was going, what shows she was watching, how difficult it still was to trust people. Colton didn't push her. He just listened. He didn't offer solutions or try to fix things, but simply made space for her to be honest. He was learning, slowly, that rebuilding wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency. It was about showing up even when the conversation was uncomfortable or when there was nothing left to say. One rainy Saturday afternoon, the three of them stayed inside Emily's apartment. The city was soaked and gray, and Lila had just built a blanket fort that took up most of the living room. Colton sat inside it with her while Emily prepared tea in the kitchen. Lila declared him king of the fort and placed a construction paper crown on his head. He laughed, but it wasn't forced. It was real. Later, while Lila napped, Emily joined him on the couch. There was silence, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt warm, like something was quietly healing between them. "I used to wonder," she said finally, "what would have happened if you hadn't sent me away that night." He didn't look at her at first. His voice was low when he answered. "I wonder that too. Every day. I don't think I could have told you I was pregnant back then. You were so angry. You wouldn't have believed me." "I wouldn't have," he admitted. "I was so sure I'd been betrayed that I didn't even stop to ask why it hurt so much." Emily nodded slowly. "I don't say this to hurt you, Colton, but you broke me back then. You broke both of us. And I've only just started to forgive myself for letting it happen." He looked at her then, his voice firmer now. "I know I broke you. I know I broke everything. But I want to help build something new. Even if it's just co-parenting. Even if it's just for Lila. She's happy," Emily said. "You make her feel safe." "I never thought I'd say that." "That means more than you know," he whispered. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted again. They didn't hold hands. They didn't touch. But the distance between them felt smaller than ever. Days passed. Colton continued to show up. He bought children's books and kept them in his car in case Lila wanted a story while waiting somewhere. He learned how to braid her hair properly, after watching YouTube tutorials late at night. He kept a spare pair of her shoes in his apartment, just in case. Slowly, gently, Emily began to trust him with more, an overnight visit, a doctor's appointment, even picking her up from preschool. One afternoon, Lila was unusually quiet in the car. He asked what was wrong, and after a moment, she said, "Mommy says sometimes people say sorry but don't really mean it. Do you really mean it?" He pulled the car over and turned to face her. "Yes," he said. "More than anything I've ever said in my life." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." That night, Colton couldn't sleep. He thought about how fragile trust was, how easily it could be broken and how long it took to rebuild. But he also thought about how powerful it was when it began to return. For the first time, he let himself imagine a future where Lila grew up knowing her father was never going to vanish again. And maybe, just maybe, a future where Emily stopped seeing him as the man who left, and started seeing him as the one who chose to come back and stay. It wouldn't be easy. He didn't expect it to be. But for the first time, he wasn't running from the work it would take. He was ready for it. Every day, every mistake, every conversation. He was ready to build something that could last. Not because it would be perfect, but because it would be real. The decision to pursue joint custody came after weeks of quiet reflection, deep conversations with lawyers, and many sleepless nights. Colton didn't take it lightly. He knew how delicate the situation was, how easily it could tip into resentment or defensiveness. But more than anything, he wanted to be a permanent, reliable part of Lila's world. Not a guest. Not a backup. A father. He approached Emily with caution, sitting her down on a Sunday afternoon while Lila napped in the next room. "I've been thinking about something for a while," he began, careful with his words. "I don't want to make decisions without talking to you first, and I don't want to start a war. But I would like to ask for joint custody. I want to do this the right way. I want to be responsible, not just when it's convenient, but always." Emily looked at him, her face unreadable for a moment. She stirred her tea slowly, not answering immediately. The tension in the room thickened as Colton waited. "You really think you're ready for that?" she asked finally, her voice not accusatory but genuinely uncertain. "I know I'm not perfect," he replied. "I know I've messed up more than once, and I can't erase that. But I also know what it means to show up now. I know what she likes in her lunch. I know the sound of her laugh when she's sleepy. I know she starts to cry if the tag on her shirt scratches her neck. I want to be there for more of it. All of it." Emily didn't speak for a long time. She stared into her cup like it might hold the right answer. Finally, she nodded. "If you really want this, then we'll go through the process. But Colton, this is going to get complicated. You'll be questioned. Your past will be dragged up. And if you get tired or scared or angry, I need you to remember that this isn't about you. It's about her." "I know," he said softly. "That's why I won't back down." The legal process began the next week. Papers were filed, meetings arranged, and family assessments scheduled. Colton cooperated fully, attending every appointment, answering every question, and making no effort to paint himself as a hero. When asked about the years he missed, he told the truth. When asked about his current involvement, he provided details, receipts, calendars. It wasn't about building a case, it was about building a future. Emily, for her part, was firm but fair. She didn't hide her pain or downplay her concerns, but she acknowledged the change she'd seen in him. "He's not the same man who sent me away," she said during one of the joint interviews. "But I'm not the same woman either. We both lost something. And now we're trying to give our daughter something better than what we had." The final hearing came 3 months later. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but it felt full. Colton sat at one table, his lawyer beside him. Emily sat at the other, calm and composed. Lila waited with a court-appointed child advocate in a nearby room, playing with blocks while adults decided her future. The judge, a silver-haired woman with tired but kind eyes, reviewed the reports and spoke to both parents directly. "Mr. Harper," she said, "do you understand what it means to share custody? This isn't visitation. This is co-parenting. It means communication. It means presence. It means sacrifice." "Yes, Your Honor," he answered without hesitation. "And Ms. Bennett," the judge continued, "do you believe Mr. Harper can be a consistent, safe, and emotionally available father?" Emily looked at Colton. He didn't know what she would say. Then she nodded. "Yes. I believe he can. The judge made her ruling. Joint custody was granted with a gradual transition plan. The courtroom was silent for a beat, and then it was over. Papers were signed. Lives, slowly, were set to change. Colton stepped out into the hallway afterward and leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. Emily came out a few moments later, holding Lila's hand. She wants to go get ice cream, Emily said, her tone light for the first time that day. I'd like that, Colton replied. They walked together to a small cafe down the street. Lila bounced between them, holding one hand in each of theirs, completely unaware of the complexity of what had just unfolded. To her, it was a normal day. A happy day. And maybe, Colton thought, that was the point. That evening, after he dropped them off and returned home, Colton stood alone in the nursery he'd finally finished in his apartment. It wasn't fancy, soft green walls, a small bookshelf, a cozy bed. On the shelf was the paper crown Lila had once made for him, now sitting like a symbol of a promise. He didn't cry, but something in his chest loosened, like a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. He looked around and whispered to no one, "This is home now." Not just the room, not the walls, but the life being built inside it. A life he would never walk away from again. Life slowly began to feel like something steady. The transition to shared custody was far from seamless, but it was honest. Colton made mistakes, small ones, like forgetting to pack Lila's favorite spoon in her lunchbox or mixing up pajama day at preschool, but he learned. He adapted. And more importantly, he didn't run from the discomfort of parenting. He faced it head-on. Mornings began with tiny shoes and cereal negotiations. Evenings ended with bedtime stories and sometimes quiet tears when Lila missed her mom. He never pretended to have all the answers. He just showed up, every time. Emily saw the difference in him. At first, she watched from a distance, almost waiting for the other shoe to drop. But weeks passed, and he didn't disappear. He didn't make excuses or fall back into the rhythms of his old life. Instead, he adjusted. He started taking calls only after Lila was dropped off at school. He rescheduled investor meetings to make room for dance class recitals. His team at work noticed a change in him, not a loss of focus, but a reordering of priorities. For the first time, Colton Harper wasn't driven by power. He was driven by love. With time, the strain between him and Emily began to soften. They exchanged small jokes during pickups, lingered longer during drop-offs, sometimes sharing coffee when Lila was inside playing. Conversations became easier, less defensive. They talked about parenting styles, bedtime routines, and favorite cartoons. And then, slowly, about life beyond the child they shared. Emily told him about a book she'd read recently that made her cry, and he listened. He told her about a dream he had where he was stuck in a ballet class with toddlers, and she laughed, not because it was hilarious, but because it felt natural to laugh with him again. One weekend, they all went to the museum together, no custody handoffs, no clock watching, just the three of them wandering through exhibits with sticky hands and child-sized headphones. Lila wanted to hold both of their hands at the same time, swinging between them like a pendulum of joy. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a test. It was just a day. And it worked. That evening, when they returned to Emily's apartment, Lila fell asleep in the car. Colton carried her upstairs and tucked her in with a care that used to terrify him. He stood at the doorway, watching her breathe, unsure if he should say goodbye or linger. Emily leaned against the wall, arms crossed but relaxed. "You've changed," she said quietly. "I had to," he replied. "But more than that, I wanted to. I didn't know what I was missing until I had it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was pain in her eyes, but also something else. Something softer. "I used to lie awake thinking about how you would have handled being a father if you'd stayed. I never imagined this version of you." "Neither did I," he said. "But I like him a lot more than who I used to be." She nodded, and for a brief second, it felt like they were standing on the edge of something new, not the old relationship reborn, but a new connection formed out of truth and hard-earned trust. "I'm not expecting anything," he added quickly. "Just being here is more than I thought I'd get. But if someday there's room for more, I'd like that. And if not, I'll still be here." Emily didn't answer right away. But she didn't walk away either. That night, after Colton left, she sat beside Lila's bed and watched her daughter sleep. She thought about forgiveness, not as a moment, but as a process. And she realized that maybe, just maybe, they were already in the middle of it. Not because everything had healed, but because she could finally imagine a future where it could. Spring arrived slowly that year, unfolding with soft sunlight, budding trees, and the gentle return of warmth to the city streets. It had been nearly a year since Colton had first heard the cry of a little girl in an airport that turned his world upside down. The rhythm of their new life had settled into something close to natural. Colton and Emily shared custody with ease now, texts sent without tension, weekends arranged without conflict, and pickups that often turned into shared meals or park visits with all three of them. The days of icy silence in courtrooms were behind them. What had replaced it wasn't perfection, but something far more valuable: mutual respect, effort, and the slow blooming of something that felt a lot like peace. Colton had moved to a quieter neighborhood just 10 minutes from Emily's place, close enough that Lila could feel like both homes belonged to her. He bought a modest house with a backyard, a swing set, and a spare bedroom that quickly became filled with coloring books, tiny shoes, and bedtime stuffed animals. On weekends, Lila helped him cook pancakes, her curls tied up in messy buns, her fingers sticky with batter. In the evenings, he'd read to her from the same books Emily once used, and every night, before turning off the light, he kissed her forehead and whispered the same words: "You are loved. You are safe. I'm not going anywhere." Emily still worked long hours, still carried the quiet strength she always had, but she no longer looked like someone holding everything together alone. There was a softness in her now, a visible ease that came from not having to do it all by herself. On the nights when Colton had Lila, she sometimes came over for dinner, at first just to keep the girl settled, but later because it started to feel comfortable. They talked more. They laughed. Sometimes they argued, but now they did it with the understanding that they were on the same side. Co-parenting became the foundation, but something else had begun to grow over it. One evening, after a particularly long day, Emily stayed later than usual. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie, her head in Colton's lap, her hand resting on his. Emily sat across from them with a glass of tea, watching them quietly. Her eyes weren't guarded the way they used to be. After a long silence, she finally said, "She loves you. Not because you're trying to impress her, but because you're there. Every day. You became what she needed." Colton looked down at Lila, overwhelmed as always by the simple miracle of her existence. "She became what I needed too," he said. "Both of you did." Emily didn't speak, but her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. She stood, walked over, and gently lifted Lila in her arms. "Come on, sleepy girl," she whispered. Colton followed her to the door, offering to walk them down. As they reached the car, Emily turned to him. "I'm not sure what this is," she said, voice low and a little unsteady. "But I want to find out." He didn't ask for clarification. He just nodded, his heart thudding. "Me too." The following months passed like a slow-moving sunrise. They didn't rush into anything. There were no dramatic declarations or rushed decisions. Instead, there were shared holidays, quiet mornings with 3 mugs of hot cocoa, and the gradual closing of the emotional space between them. Lila began calling them her team. And in many ways, that's exactly what they had become. Then one day, standing in the kitchen while Lila drew at the table nearby, Emily looked up from her coffee and said, almost casually, "So, do you want to come with us to visit my parents next weekend?" Colton smiled slowly, understanding the depth of the offer. "I'd love to," he said. It wasn't a story of instant reconciliation or fairy tale perfection. It was a story of a man who lost his way, a woman who protected her child with everything she had, and a little girl who unknowingly built a bridge between them with her very existence. Their love didn't come back the way it once was, it returned in a new form, forged in vulnerability, humility, and a shared desire to be better for someone else. By the time Lila turned 5, she had 2 homes that felt like one, and 2 parents who had grown into something stronger than the pain that once separated them. On her birthday, they hosted a small party in the backyard of Colton's house. Lila wore a yellow dress, spun in circles until she got dizzy, and when it came time to blow out her candles, she looked at both of them and grinned. "I want this forever," she said, pointing to the 3 of them standing together. Colton looked at Emily. She smiled, took his hand in hers, and nodded. "So do I." And for the first time, Colton Harper, the man who once had everything but felt nothing, finally understood what it meant to truly have it all. Not wealth. Not success. But family. A home. And a second chance he would never take for granted again. The ending of this story feels both deeply earned and quietly powerful. It's not a fantasy wrapped in a neat bow, it's a redemption story grounded in emotional truth. What makes it compelling isn't just the reunion between a father and the daughter he never knew he had, but the slow, painful work of rebuilding trust with the woman he once hurt. The final chapters don't rush forgiveness, nor do they rely on dramatic declarations. Instead, they honor the quiet bravery it takes to stay, to listen, and to grow. In a world where people often mistake love for perfection, this story reminds us that love is actually forged in the messy middle, through small choices, patient effort, and showing up day after day. The fact that Colton doesn't just earn a relationship with his daughter but also rebuilds a new kind of partnership with Emily feels not only satisfying, but hopeful in the most human way. It's a rare kind of ending, one that shocks you with its tenderness, not its twists. Ryan Weston never stopped for anyone, until the day he knelt on a busy sidewalk to tie the shoelaces of a little girl who didn't expect help from anyone at all. Ryan Weston was used to walking fast and thinking faster. His world was a perfectly tuned system of precision, efficiency, and structure. That morning was no different. He had a shareholders meeting across town and was already a few minutes behind schedule. His assistant had just called to remind him that the board would not wait, and as he strode across the marble-paved square, his mind was already working through talking points and stock projections. He didn't notice the crowds thinning out near the edge of the plaza, nor did he pay much attention to the growing stillness. He was locked into his routine, his thoughts sharp and unbending. Then someone, caught the corner of his vision. It wasn't movement that stopped him, but the absence of it. A little girl stood on the pavement, perfectly still, her head lowered and her shoulders stiff. She couldn't have been older than 5. Her dress was a little faded, her blonde hair tied back with a crooked ribbon, and her shoes, pink and worn, were untied. She wasn't crying or calling out for help. She simply stood there, eyes fixed on her own feet, as if unsure whether she was allowed to take another step. Most passers-by had already looked past her. Ryan almost did too. He had somewhere to be. But he stopped. Something in her posture, in the quiet determination not to cry, held him there. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't begging. She was waiting. He took a cautious step forward, unsure what to say or whether she would run. But she didn't move. When he reached her, he crouched down, not a motion he made often or comfortably, and noticed the laces on both her shoes had come undone. She looked at him then, her large brown eyes meeting his with quiet calm. He didn't ask questions. He simply reached out and began tying her shoes, slow and careful, as if every movement might scare her away. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak until he finished the second knot. Then she said one soft word, "Thank you." That single word hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just gratitude, it was surprise. She hadn't expected help. She had expected to stand there indefinitely, forgotten in a crowd that moved too fast to care. Ryan stood, still looking at her. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. She hesitated, then said, "I don't know." There was something about the way she said it, not with fear, but with honesty, that made his pulse shift. "Where are your parents?" he tried again. She shrugged. "Mommy's asleep." She didn't wake up. The words landed with a weight that cut through everything. Ryan didn't ask more. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't even think about the meeting he was now officially missing. Instead, he looked around the square. No one had stopped. No one was watching. He reached out his hand and said gently, "Let's get something warm to drink." She nodded and took his hand. And just like that, Ryan Weston, the man who had built an empire on never being interrupted, was walking away from his schedule, guided by a 5-year-old girl with untied shoes and eyes that saw more than a child ever should. The cafe they stepped into was quiet and warm, its soft lighting and smell of fresh pastries a comforting contrast to the cold detachment of the city outside. Ryan held the door open as the girl walked in ahead of him, her small hand still wrapped loosely around his finger. She didn't seem afraid, just cautious, like she'd learned to study a room before choosing a place to exist within it. He guided her to a booth in the corner, away from the windows, where the light spilled onto the table in soft golden streaks. She climbed into the seat without a word, her feet not quite reaching the edge of the cushion. Ryan sat across from her and for a moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers with nothing in common but that strange sense of being exactly where neither of them had planned to be. A waitress came over and greeted them with a smile, but Ryan barely looked at the menu. "Hot chocolate," he said, glancing at the girl. "And something sweet." She didn't argue. She didn't ask for anything. She just nodded. When the waitress left, Ryan leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the table. "Do you remember your full name?" he asked gently. The girl tilted her head. "Mommy called me Lily." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But I don't know the rest." "Lily," he repeated, trying the name out like a delicate object. It suited her, simple, quiet, and unassuming. She traced one finger along the pattern on the tabletop. "I had a last name once. But I don't remember it now." Ryan felt a strange chill move through him. He'd handled some of the most ruthless boardroom negotiations imaginable, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the heartbreak of a child forgetting their own identity. "Where did you last see your mom?" he asked, trying to stay steady. Lily didn't look up. She was tired. She laid down in our room and wouldn't wake up. The people came in a car with lights and took her. Then I was with ladies who told me I had to sleep with other kids. But I didn't want to. So I left. Ryan blinked slowly. She said it so plainly, with no emotion, like she'd already repeated it to herself 100 times. She wasn't trying to gain his sympathy. She was just telling the truth. "How long ago was that?" he asked. Lily shrugged. "I don't know. A lot of sleeps. Maybe 6. The hot chocolate arrived, topped with a swirl of whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Lily stared at it, then carefully wrapped both hands around the mug as if afraid it would be taken away. She sipped quietly, her eyes never leaving the cup. Ryan watched her for a long moment before pulling out his phone and typing a quiet message to his assistant, "Cancel all meetings today. Do not reschedule until further notice." He ended the message and looked at Lily again. "Do you have anyone else? Family?" She shook her head. "Mommy said it was just us now. Before that it was no one." There was a long silence between them. Ryan had no idea what he was doing. He was a man who thrived on control, on logic, on measurable outcomes. But nothing about this moment could be measured. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. "Would it be okay if I helped you for a little while?" he asked carefully. "Just until we find out where you're supposed to be." Lily looked up at him for the first time with something new in her expression, something uncertain, but hopeful. She nodded once, then went back to her cocoa. And just like that, a man who had built his life on predictability found himself taking his first step into the unknown. The drive back to Ryan's penthouse was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Lily sat in the back seat, hugging a small paper bag from the cafe with a chocolate croissant inside. She didn't speak, but she watched the world outside the window with wide, curious eyes. Ryan checked the rearview mirror more times than. Ryan left the cafe with Lily by his side, the warmth of her small hand and is still surprising him every time she held on without hesitation. The street outside was busier now, but the world felt quieter to him somehow, as if the chaos of his usual routine had been turned down and replaced with something more deliberate. He flagged down a car, helped Lily into the back seat, and gave his driver a new destination, not his office, not the boardroom where he was expected, but his apartment. He wasn't entirely sure why. He just knew the thought of handing her over to strangers felt wrong, even if those strangers were professionals. Lily didn't question him. She sat silently beside him, watching the passing buildings with calm curiosity, like she was memorizing a city she didn't expect to stay in for long. His apartment was modern and minimal, a skyline view penthouse that had always been more aesthetic than personal. As the door opened, Lily stepped inside cautiously, not as someone arriving at a new home, but as someone who wasn't sure if she belonged. She didn't touch anything. She stood quietly, looking around with wide eyes, and then sat on the edge of the couch, her legs dangling over the side. Ryan loosened his tie, suddenly aware of how cold the space looked. There were no soft blankets, no family photos, no hint that a child could find comfort here. He opened the fridge and quickly realized he had nothing suitable for a 5-year-old. That didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how much it bothered him now. He ordered groceries immediately, simple things, like milk and cereal and fruit. Then he returned to the living room where Lily was still sitting in the exact same spot, her hands folded in her lap. He sat beside her, trying to relax his posture, and asked if she wanted to take a nap. She shook her head and said softly, "I only sleep when I know I'm not going to be moved again." The word stunned him. He had assumed she was tired, possibly exhausted. But it wasn't about physical rest for her. It was about trust. About the fear of waking up somewhere new again. He didn't know what to say, so instead, he walked to the hallway closet, grabbed the softest throw he could find, and brought it back to her. He gently draped it over her shoulders. She blinked at him, then slowly leaned against the pillow beside her, clutching the blanket close. It wasn't sleep, not really, but it was the closest thing to safety she'd known in days. He watched her for a moment before pulling out his laptop. While she rested, he started searching, hospitals, social services, missing child reports, anything connected to a girl named Lily with no last name and a mother named Celine. It didn't take long to find a report about a woman who had died in her apartment just over a week ago, with a note that a minor child had been removed from the home. The child had disappeared 2 nights later from a temporary care facility. His jaw tightened. The system had already failed her once. She was his responsibility now, at least until someone proved otherwise. That evening, after Lily had quietly accepted a bowl of cereal and curled up on the couch with a cartoon playing softly in the background, Ryan sat at his desk and called his lawyer. He didn't explain much, just that he had a child staying with him, and he needed to understand what legal rights he had to protect her. He gave her full name, or what he believed it was. He asked the lawyer to dig into the donor program he'd anonymously contributed to years ago, though he wasn't sure why that part had surfaced in his thoughts. By the time the sun set, Lily was asleep with her head against a cushion, the blanket still pulled up to her chin. Ryan turned off the TV and stood watching her for a long time. He didn't feel overwhelmed, or lost, or afraid. He felt steady. And that surprised him more than anything. Because in all the plans he had ever made, not one of them involved a little girl with untied shoes and a voice quiet enough to break him open. The following morning, the apartment was bathed in early light. Ryan woke earlier than usual, not because of his alarm, but because he had barely slept. His mind had been caught between quiet worry and an overwhelming need to understand what came next. He moved quietly through the apartment, unsure if Lily would still be there or if she would vanish like a dream he'd imagined too vividly. But when he stepped into the living room, she was right where he had left her, curled up on the couch, blanket tangled around her legs, one small hand tucked under her cheek. She was still wearing the same clothes from the day before, her hair tangled, but her face was peaceful. It was the first time he truly saw her as a child, not a burden or a mystery, but someone who had trusted him enough to fall asleep without fear. He let her sleep and brewed coffee while checking his email. The usual flood of board updates, legal summaries, and scheduling conflicts now felt distant and irrelevant. The lawyer had responded to his late-night message with a request to speak urgently. Ryan dialed the number immediately. The conversation was quiet, private, and, by the end, life-altering. The lawyer confirmed what Ryan had only half suspected: the fertility program he had invested in years ago had matched his profile with a single recipient, a woman named Celine Brooks. The name froze him in place. He remembered her, not vividly, but enough. She had been kind, reserved, determined to raise a child on her own. She hadn't wanted money or a contract, just a chance. According to the file, Celine had given birth to a daughter. No name was listed for the child, but the timeline aligned perfectly with Lily's age. Ryan didn't speak for several seconds. The lawyer asked if he wanted to pursue paternity testing or legal guardianship. He only said one word: yes. When Lily woke, he was still sitting at the table, the coffee untouched. She rubbed her eyes, looked around as if expecting to be somewhere else, and when she saw him, she didn't speak. She just sat up and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He asked if she was hungry, and she nodded, still silent. He poured her a bowl of cereal and sat across from her as she ate in slow, thoughtful bites. "I talked to someone about your mom," he said gently. She stopped eating, but didn't look up. "Her name was Celine, right?" Lily nodded without a word. He hesitated, then continued. "I think I might have known her. A long time ago. Before you were born." Now she looked up, her expression unreadable. "Did she like you?" He smiled softly. "I think so. We didn't stay in touch, but I never forgot her." Lily didn't respond, but she kept eating, a little faster this time. When she finished, she picked up the bowl and walked it over to the sink. Ryan watched her, surprised again by her independence. She was so small, but so used to taking care of herself. He cleared his throat. "I want you to stay here for now. I'm going to talk to some people and make sure that's okay. But you'll have your own room, your own bed. Would that be all right?" She stood still, her back to him, then turned slowly. "I don't have anywhere else." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't desperation. It was a fact. And that made it heavier. That afternoon, Ryan turned his guest room into something softer: new sheets, a small desk, a shelf filled with a few toys he had delivered the same day. When Lily walked in and saw it, she didn't run to it or scream with joy. She simply walked over to the bed, sat down, and whispered, "This is mine." He nodded. She didn't cry, but her voice trembled when she said thank you. As the day ended, Ryan knew his life had changed. Not in some abstract way, not like a new contract or a major acquisition. This was real. This was personal. Lily wasn't just a stranger who needed help. She was his daughter. And every instinct in him told him that whatever came next, he would face it for her. Ryan sat in his office that evening, though it didn't feel like his office anymore. It was still filled with sleek furniture, polished surfaces, and muted lighting, but something had shifted. The presence of a child in his home had softened the atmosphere in ways he never could have anticipated. Her tiny shoes by the door, her quiet humming as she colored in the other room, even the sound of her cereal spoon tapping the bowl that morning, all of it had left an imprint. He wasn't used to silence being meaningful. Now it carried weight. The report from his attorney sat on the table in front of him, unopened. He already knew what it said. He had been the anonymous donor. Celine had chosen to raise their daughter alone, and now that she was gone, Lily was, by every legal and moral definition, his. He thought about the past, not with regret, but with a strange ache. Years ago, when he signed that contract to donate, it hadn't seemed like anything more than a technical arrangement. He wasn't ready for fatherhood then, and he hadn't imagined it would ever come back to him. But it had, and now it lived in his guest room, sleeping with a stuffed rabbit under her chin. He couldn't stop thinking about how quietly she had adapted, how she didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, didn't even seem surprised when he said she could stay. Later that night, Ryan made a second call to his lawyer and asked about expedited guardianship. It wouldn't be easy, especially without a formal claim filed by another relative, but the lawyer believed it was possible. "There's no record of other family," she said. "But if someone comes forward, the courts will want to know what's best for Lily. That's all that matters now." That idea, that he had to prove he was the best option, unsettled him. He wasn't a parent. He hadn't read the books or practiced bedtime routines or learned how to braid hair. But he had shown up when no one else did. And he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Lily woke up and came into the kitchen in her pajamas, her hair a mess of soft tangles. She rubbed her eyes and sat down at the table without saying anything. He slid a bowl of oatmeal in front of her, unsure if she'd like it. She took one bite, then nodded silently in approval. It was the first time she'd eaten without hesitation. He smiled and poured her some juice. After breakfast, he asked if she wanted to go out. She looked up, uncertain. "To where?" she asked. "Someplace with books," he replied. "And crayons. And snacks. Somewhere just for you." The children's store they visited was quiet and bright, with shelves filled with picture books, small tables with puzzles, and soft music playing in the background. Lily didn't rush through the aisles. She moved carefully, touching things like they might disappear. He told her she could pick out 5 things. She only chose 3, a book about a bear and his forest friends, a tin of colored pencils, and a small pink backpack. Back home, she filled the backpack and carried it from room to room, like she was preparing herself for something even she didn't understand. He watched her carefully, giving her space, but always nearby. That afternoon, as he worked on his laptop in the corner of the living room, she brought her drawing pad to him and showed him a picture. It was a house, with 2 stick figures holding hands. One was tall, wearing a tie. The other was small, with a bow in her hair. She didn't say anything as he looked at it, but when he looked up and met her eyes, she smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. Something inside him shifted then. Not all at once, not in a wave of emotion, but quietly, the way dawn edges out the dark. He was still learning what it meant to be a parent, still unsure of how to meet her needs, but one thing was absolutely clear. Lily wasn't just a responsibility. She was his daughter. And he was already hers. The days began to settle into a kind of rhythm that Ryan had never experienced before. His mornings were no longer consumed by rushing out the door or reading financial briefs over espresso. Instead, he woke earlier to the sound of soft footsteps padding across hardwood floors, or the whisper of Lily talking quietly to herself as she arranged her toys. He made her breakfast, something simple like toast with jam or fruit and oatmeal, and sat across from her while she ate, her small presence grounding him more than any board meeting ever had. Work hadn't disappeared entirely, but his priorities had shifted. He checked in with his team remotely, trusted his executives to carry out plans, and refused meetings that required travel or late hours. His assistant stopped questioning his calendar changes. The people around him were beginning to realize that something had changed. Lily, in her quiet way, was blossoming. She didn't speak much unless she was asked a direct question, but her eyes had started to brighten. She no longer hesitated before taking a seat on the couch. She hummed when she colored. She stopped looking around the room as if waiting to be moved again. Every small change was a sign that she was starting to feel safe. Ryan noticed it all, the way she gently lined up her new books on the shelf he'd given her, how she insisted on folding her pajamas every morning, and how she began to leave her drawings on his desk without a word, as if she was giving him pieces of herself to keep. One evening, just after dinner, Ryan received a call from his attorney. She had news: the formal guardianship hearing had been set for the following week. The courts were moving quickly, partly due to the lack of any competing claims and partly because Ryan had the resources and intent to take care of Lily without delay. Still, she reminded him that until the paperwork was signed, it wasn't final. The conversation left him more anxious than he expected. After hanging up, he walked into Lily's room, where she was arranging her pencils by color. She looked up and smiled faintly, sensing something was different. He sat on the floor beside her and explained, gently, that there would be a meeting soon with people who needed to understand why she should stay with him. She didn't seem scared, only curious. "Do I have to leave?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not if I can help it." She thought for a moment. "Will they ask if I want to stay?" He nodded. "They might." She considered that carefully, then said, "Then I'll say yes." The simplicity of her trust shook him. That night, after she fell asleep with her pink backpack still clutched in one hand, Ryan sat alone in the living room. He stared out the tall windows, the city sparkling below, and let himself feel everything he had kept tucked away: the fear of failing her, the strange joy of being needed, and the quiet hope that he could build a life that included her, not as a temporary obligation, but as a permanent part of his world. The following day, they went to the park together. Lily ran for the first time since arriving, her laughter echoing across the green space as she chased birds and kicked leaves. Ryan watched her from a bench, hands in his lap, a subtle smile on his face. He wasn't thinking about business or investors. He was watching his daughter discover joy, and for the first time in years, that was more than enough. When she ran back to him, flushed and breathless, she said, "Do you think Mommy would like you?" He paused, surprised by the question. Then he nodded slowly. "I hope so." Lily reached out and took his hand without saying another word. That night, as she drifted to sleep, Ryan realized he had already made the decision the courts were preparing to confirm. He didn't just want to keep her safe. He wanted to raise her, love her, and be the person she deserved. And whatever the world required of him to make that happen, he would do it without hesitation. The morning of the guardianship hearing arrived quietly, without the thunder of anxiety Ryan had expected. The sky outside was overcast, casting a soft gray light over the apartment. Lily woke up earlier than usual, and instead of her usual silence, she walked into the kitchen and asked what they were doing today. Ryan crouched beside her and told her the truth in simple words. They were going to meet some people who needed to see how brave and strong she was, and how much she mattered. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded and asked if she could bring her drawing of the house they had made together. He said yes, and she tucked it into her pink backpack as if it were the most important document in the world. The courthouse was tall and sterile, a building Ryan had visited before for contracts and disputes, never for anything this personal. He held Lily's hand tightly as they entered the waiting area. She looked small and out of place, but not afraid. She wore a simple dress, pale blue with a little bow at the waist, and her hair was freshly brushed, tucked behind her ears. He had never felt so protective in his life. The attorney arrived with calm professionalism, explaining how the hearing would go, what to expect, and reminding Ryan that the judge might speak to Lily directly. Inside the courtroom, the judge was kind but thorough. She reviewed the paperwork, asked about Lily's time in temporary care, and questioned Ryan about his decision to assume custody. He answered everything honestly. He told the truth about how he met Lily, how unprepared he had been, and how something changed the moment she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes. He told the judge that he hadn't expected to become a father, but that now he couldn't imagine anything else. Lily sat quietly next to him, feet swinging above the floor, her drawing held tightly in her lap. Then the judge looked at Lily and asked if she wanted to speak. Ryan leaned in and whispered, "Only if you want to." She stood up slowly, clutching the drawing in both hands, and walked to the front. The courtroom was silent. She unfolded the paper and held it up, showing the judge the picture of the house with two stick figures holding hands. "This is me and him," she said, pointing. "He makes my cereal the way I like it. He lets me pick my own books. And he doesn't move me when I'm sleeping. I don't want to go anywhere else." The judge didn't smile right away. She studied Lily for a long moment, then nodded. The rest of the hearing moved quickly after that. A decision was issued. Ryan Weston was granted legal guardianship, with full rights and responsibilities. It was done. As they walked out of the courthouse, Lily didn't say anything, but her grip on Ryan's hand was firmer than it had ever been. Outside on the steps, she finally spoke. "Does this mean I live with you now forever?" Ryan crouched down and looked her in the eyes. "Yes. Forever." She looked at him for a moment, as if checking to be sure, then threw her arms around his neck and whispered, "Okay." That evening, back home, Ryan cooked pasta, badly, overcooking the noodles, but Lily ate it without complaint. She spent the rest of the night drawing new pictures, this time of a bigger house with more people. She drew herself, Ryan, and even added a cat they didn't have yet. Before bed, she asked if she could call him Dad. He froze for a second, not because he didn't want to hear it, but because he wasn't sure he deserved it. But he nodded. She whispered the word once before curling under the blankets. And as she drifted to sleep, Ryan sat quietly in the doorway, heart full in a way that had nothing to do with success or money or power. He had walked into that cafe a stranger to her. Now he was her entire world. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it longer days and a softness in the air that Ryan hadn't noticed in years. His world, once defined by schedules and margins, had shifted so completely that he barely recognized the man he used to be. Mornings were now filled with the smell of toast and laughter echoing down the hallway. His penthouse had changed too, not in the architecture or decor, but in spirit. There were now drawings on the fridge, little shoes by the front door, a backpack resting in the hallway, and a quiet warmth that came from knowing someone small and important was always waiting for him to come home. Lily had grown more confident. She talked more, asked more questions, and laughed freely. She had made a friend at school named Grace, and every evening, she told Ryan detailed stories about their imaginary adventures as if they were urgent news. He listened to every word. He started reading to her before bed, not just short picture books, but longer stories with chapters, because she said she liked stories that didn't end too fast. On weekends, they explored bookstores and parks. He took her to the lake once, and she asked if they could come back every year, just the two of them, no matter what. He promised they would. Julia, Celine's sister, came to visit often. She and Ryan developed a friendship built on shared care for the same child and a quiet grief that neither had quite processed. Julia told stories about Celine, filling in pieces of Lily's memory with kindness and truth. Sometimes, they sat together after Lily was asleep, just sharing silence or photos. There were no accusations between them. Only understanding. One Saturday afternoon, Lily and Ryan stood in front of the same cafe where they had met months before. She recognized it immediately. "This is where I found you," she said. Ryan smiled and replied, "I think it's where we found each other." She nodded, then reached for his hand. They walked inside and sat at the same booth. This time, she ordered hot chocolate confidently, and he got the same for himself. While they waited, she pulled out a small drawing she had made that morning. It was of them standing under a tree, holding hands, with the word family scribbled in shaky block letters above their heads. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at her. "You drew this for me?" She nodded. "It's us. Do you feel like we're a family now?" She didn't even hesitate. "You're my dad." He folded the picture and tucked it into his wallet without a word, right where most men kept business cards and receipts. That small paper meant more to him than every contract he had ever signed. When they returned home that night, he hung the drawing on the wall above her bed. She asked if they could frame it, and he promised they would. The story of their lives didn't end in a courtroom or a dramatic moment. It continued in the ordinary details: homework on the kitchen table, mismatched socks, pancake sundaes, whispered dreams at bedtime. Ryan no longer saw her as a responsibility that had found him by accident. She was his choice, and he was hers. He still worked. He still owned companies, still signed deals, but now, his most important title wasn't CEO. It was Dad. And in the quiet hours after she fell asleep, he sometimes stood in the hallway just outside her room, listening to her breathing, marveling at how a man so certain he needed nothing had somehow ended up with everything. In my view, the ending of this story is a quiet triumph, not because everything becomes perfect, but because something deeply human and transformative happens in the most ordinary moments. What makes it powerful is its honesty. Ryan doesn't become a hero by saving the world. He becomes one by choosing to show up for a child who had no reason to expect kindness. That decision, simple and spontaneous, unravels the carefully built walls around his life and reveals a version of himself he didn't know he could be. Lily's presence doesn't just change him, it restores him. Her trust is not easily earned, but once given, it redefines what success and purpose mean for a man who had once measured everything in numbers. Their bond grows not through dramatic gestures, but through breakfast, bedtime stories, shoelaces, and drawings. That's what makes the story feel real. It reminds us that love doesn't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it shows up when we least expect it, and asks us to stay. The happy ending doesn't come from solving every problem. It comes from two people choosing each other every day, and finding home not in a place, but in a relationship that neither of them saw coming. That's the kind of ending that lingers, and feels earned.